You are barren." The words, spoken by his aunt, Lady Beatrice, were not a question. They were a pronouncement, a final, unassailable judgment, delivered over a delicate porcelain cup of tea. Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood, did not so much as flinch. His face, a mask of aristocratic indifference carved from pale stone, remained placid. He simply stared into the heart of the fire, watching the embers pulse like the dying heart of a star. "The doctors have confirmed it," she continued, her voice a silken rasp, the sound of a knife being sharpened on velvet. "A quiet affliction. One of nobility, you understand. A consequence of our finely tuned bloodlines." He said nothing. He had heard this before, whispered in corridors of his own mind, planted there by her careful, insidious gardening. He was the Duke. He had the title, the lands, the wealth that could make kings weep with envy. But he could not produce an heir. It was his one monumental failure, a crack in the gilded facade of his existence. "And Alara," Beatrice sighed, a theatrical exhalation of sorrow. "She is so fragile, so prone to melancholy. I fear the strain of her duty, her inability to fulfill it, is beginning to fracture her mind." Alistair's jaw tightened, a barely perceptible clench of muscle. Alara, his duchess. She was another of his acquisitions, chosen for her impeccable lineage and quiet beauty, a perfect ornament for his cold, sprawling estate. He saw her at dinner, a silent wraith at the other end of the impossibly long mahogany table. He saw her in the gardens, a distant figure in pale silks, her head bowed as if in prayer or despair. He felt her absence in his bed more keenly than he had ever felt her presence. She was a ghost in her own home, and he, the master of the house, was the chief haunt. The air in Blackwood Manor was always cold, regardless of the season. It smelled of beeswax, damp stone, and centuries of secrets. It was a weight on the chest, a pressure behind the eyes. For Alara, it was the air of a tomb. She moved through the grand, echoing halls, her footsteps swallowed by thick Aubusson carpets, her reflection a fleeting stranger in the mercilessly polished surfaces of silver and wood. Every portrait on the wall, a long line of stern-faced Blackwood ancestors, seemed to watch her with accusatory eyes. They knew her failure. They knew her womb was a barren, useless thing. Lately, a new misery had taken root, a constant, rolling nausea that began at dawn and did not subside until dusk, a profound, bone-deep weariness that made the act of lifting a silver fork feel like a Herculean task. Beatrice had been so solicitous, so cloyingly kind. She plied her with weak broths and insisted on calling for Dr. Albright, a man with watery eyes and hands that trembled slightly. "Just a woman's malady, my dear," Beatrice would coo, patting Alara's hand. "A touch of hysteria brought on by disappointment. We shall have you right in no time." The word hysteria was a key, one that unlocked a very specific, very dark door in Beatrice's arsenal. It was a word that stripped a woman of her credibility, her sanity, her very self. Alara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the manor's drafts. She saw a flicker of something triumphant in her aunt-in-law's eyes, a look she had seen before, usually when Beatrice had successfully maneuvered a tenant off their land or ruined a social rival with a well-placed rumor. That evening, the breaking point arrived not with a thunderclap, but with the quiet click of the library door. Alistair was there, standing by the fire as always, his back to the room. Beatrice sat in her usual wingback chair, a spider in the center of her web, and Dr. Albright stood near the desk, wringing his hands, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Your Grace," the doctor began, his voice thin and reedy, I have concluded my examination of the Duchess." Alara stood frozen in the doorway, her hand still on the cold brass knob. She felt the eyes of the room converge on her, not as a person, but as a specimen under glass. "And?" Alistair's voice was clipped, devoid of warmth or concern. It was the voice he used with his steward. "The Duchess is with child," Albright stammered, his gaze skittering away from Alara's. For a single, impossible moment, the world stopped. A wild, unbidden hope surged through Alara's veins, so powerful it made her dizzy. A child, an heir, a reason. It was a miracle. But then she saw Beatrice's face. It was a mask of practiced sorrow, but her eyes, those sharp, intelligent eyes, were gleaming with victory. "However," the doctor rushed on, his words tumbling over one another, given your Grace's well-documented affliction." He trailed off, unable to meet the Duke's gaze. Beatrice picked up the thread seamlessly. "What the good doctor means to say, Alistair, is that the child cannot be yours." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a physical thing, a crushing weight that stole the air from Alara's lungs. She looked at her husband, at this man to whom she was bound by law and God, and waited. She waited for him to rage, to deny it, to defend her honor. She waited for him to turn on the doctor, to demand an explanation, to throw the lie back in their teeth. He did none of those things. He turned, very slowly, and his gray eyes, usually so distant and unreadable, were now filled with a cold, clear contempt that was more devastating than any physical blow. He looked at her, not as his wife, but as a betrayal personified, a piece of damaged property. "I see," he said, his voice quiet, almost conversational. The lack of emotion was the most brutal part. It was as if she had already ceased to exist for him. "Her mind, Alistair," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "It has snapped. This delusion, this desperate, tragic act to secure her position. She must have sought comfort elsewhere. She is not well. She needs care." The word hung in the air. Care. Alara knew what that meant. It meant a private asylum. It meant padded walls and locked doors. It meant the end of her life. "No," Alara whispered, the word a faint scratch in the profound silence. "Alistair, look at me. It's a lie." He did not look at her. He looked past her, through her, as if she were made of glass. He had been conditioned for years by Beatrice's whispers, his pride wounded by the idea of his own failure. This explanation, this story of a hysterical, unfaithful wife, was easier to accept than the truth of his own supposed deficiency. It fit the narrative his aunt had so carefully constructed. He believed it, instantly, unquestioningly. That was the moment her heart did not break. It turned to stone. The shock was so profound, so absolute, that it bypassed pain and went straight to a chilling, clarifying numbness. She felt the floor beneath her feet, the cold air on her skin, the frantic, terrified flutter of the life inside her. This was not a home. This was a cage, and the keepers were about to lock the final door. "Take her to her room," Alistair said to no one in particular. His voice was flat, final. "See that she is made comfortable. The arrangements will be made in the morning." He turned back to the fire, dismissing her. Just like that, an inconvenience, dealt with. Alara did not scream. She did not cry. She simply turned and walked from the room, her back straight, her head held high. A profound, acidic nausea rose in her throat, but it was not the morning sickness. It was the taste of annihilation. She had been erased, and in the cold, dead space where her love and hope had once resided, a new, harder thing was born. The will to survive, for herself, and for the child he had just disowned. The night was moonless, a thick blanket of clouds smothering the stars. Inside her opulent bedroom, Alara moved with a silent, desperate purpose. Beatrice had posted a maid outside her door, a girl with frightened eyes who wouldn't meet her gaze, but the connecting door to the dressing room led to a smaller service corridor. It was a route she had never used, a path for the invisible people who kept the great house running. Tonight, she would become one of them. She stripped off the silk gown, letting it pool on the floor like a sigh. She ignored the wardrobe filled with a queen's ransom in fabrics and jewels. Instead, she found a simple, dark wool dress she had kept from her life before marriage, a relic of a girl who was now a stranger. It was practical, sturdy, the dress of a survivor. Her hands moved methodically. She found the small velvet pouch where she kept the household money she was allotted. A pitiful sum for a duchess, but a fortune for a fugitive. She counted it. Enough. It would have to be enough. Her eyes fell on the jewelry box on her vanity. The blackwood diamonds glittered malevolently in the candlelight, cold and heavy as shackles. On a velvet tray lay her wedding ring, a simple gold band. She picked it up. It was still warm from her skin. For a moment, she remembered the man who had placed it on her finger, the stranger with sad gray eyes and a title that weighed more than he did. She remembered the flicker of hope she had felt on that day, a foolish, girlish dream of melting the ice that encased his heart. With a steady hand, she placed the ring on the pillow of the vast, empty bed. Next to it, she laid the pearls he had given her on their first anniversary, a gift delivered by his valet. A transaction. She was leaving behind every last piece of the Duchess of Blackwood. She was shedding a skin, an identity, a lie. She pulled a thick, hooded cloak from the back of the wardrobe, one meant for a servant. It smelled faintly of rain and lye soap. It was the scent of freedom. Her hand went to her still flat stomach, a protective, instinctual gesture. "It is just you and I now, little one," she whispered into the silent room. "I will not let them harm you. I swear it." The child was her anchor, her North Star in this terrifying darkness. It was no longer a potential heir to a cold dukedom, but a life, her reason. The thought gave her a strength she did not know she possessed. Slipping through the dressing room door, she found herself in a narrow, dark corridor that smelled of dust and mice. She moved by touch, her fingers trailing along the rough plaster wall. The silence here was different from the oppressive silence of the main house. It was a working silence, a silence of rest. Down winding stairs, past the sleeping kitchens, she found a small postern gate used for deliveries. The bolt was heavy and stiff with rust. It groaned in protest as she put her whole weight into it, the sound deafening in the stillness. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs, listening. Nothing. Only the sigh of the wind in the ancient yews outside. Section. The door swung open onto a blast of cold, damp air. She stepped out of Blackwood Manor and did not look back. She ran, not with panic, but with the steady, ground-eating pace of someone with a long way to go. The manicured lawns gave way to the wilder parkland, the soft grass turning to muddy track. The hem of her dress was soaked and heavy with mud, but she did not care. She walked through the night, following the road by the faint starlight that occasionally broke through the clouds. Every sound, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of a badger in the undergrowth, sent a jolt of fear through her. But the greater fear was behind her. The greater fear was the cold, clinical madness of that house, the smiling poison of Beatrice, and the devastating emptiness in her husband's eyes. By dawn, she had reached a coaching inn miles from her gilded prison. She paid for a ticket on the first mail coach heading north, pulling her hood low to hide her face. She chose a destination at random from the schedule board, a name that sounded remote, forgotten. Farley, a coastal town, a place to disappear. As the coach rumbled away, she huddled in a corner, invisible, anonymous. She was no one. She was free. The world outside the grimy window was a blur of green fields and gray sky. She watched it all with a strange sense of detachment. The Duchess of Blackwood was gone. In her place was a woman named Ellen, a widow whose husband had been lost at sea. It was a simple, sad story, a believable one, and as she repeated it to herself, a new kind of truth began to form. The Duke, her husband, was dead. He had died in that library, not with a bang, but with a quiet, dismissive turn back to a dying fire. 5 years. 5 years could be a lifetime. The woman who called herself Ellen Price bore little resemblance to the pale, fragile duchess who had fled into the night. Her hands, once soft and useless, were now strong and calloused, the nails permanently rimmed with the dark, rich soil of her garden. The sea air had weathered her face, dusting her cheeks with a healthy color and etching fine lines around her eyes, lines born not of sorrow, but of squinting into the sun and laughing at her son's antics. She lived in a small, whitewashed cottage on the edge of Farley, a town that clung to the cliffs like a hardy barnacle. The front garden, once a tangle of weeds, was now a riot of color and scent. Roses climbed the stone walls, lavender bushes hummed with bees, and neat rows of herbs filled the air with their sharp, clean perfume. This was her livelihood. She sold cut flowers and herbal remedies at a small stall in the town market, earning just enough to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. It was a hard life, a simple life, but it was hers. And at the center of that life was Thomas. He was 4 years old, a whirlwind of boundless energy and startling curiosity. He had her dark, curling hair, but his eyes were a different story. They were a clear, striking slate gray, an exact replica of the eyes of a man he would never know. When he looked at her, she sometimes felt a phantom pang, a memory of a cold library, and a devastating betrayal. But then he would smile, a wide, gap-toothed grin, and the ghost would vanish. "Mama, why is the sea angry today?" he would ask, his small hand tucked firmly in hers as they walked along the cliff path. "It's not angry, my love," she would explain, her voice soft. "It's just powerful, full of feeling." She had told him his father was a sailor, a brave man who had loved the sea more than anything. She told him his father had died a hero, his ship lost in a great storm before Thomas was born. It was a kinder truth than the real one. It gave the boy a legacy of courage, not of coldness and abandonment. It was a lie she guarded with the ferocity of a lioness. Her only real friend in Farley was Mrs. Gable, the stout, no-nonsense owner of the Salty Dog, the town's only inn. Mrs. Gable had a sharp eye and a kind heart, and from the beginning she had sensed that Ellen Price was more than she seemed. But she never asked questions. She simply offered friendship, buying Alara's lavender bundles to scent the inn's rooms and slipping Thomas a warm pastry whenever they passed by. Meanwhile, 200 miles to the south, Blackwood Manor had become a true mausoleum. Alistair moved through its silent, cavernous rooms, the echo of his own footsteps his only constant companion. The 5 years since Alara had vanished had hollowed him out. Beatrice had tried, at first, to fill the void. She had paraded a succession of eligible, simpering debutantes before him, but he had looked at them with dead eyes. The life had gone out of him. The lie had eaten away at him, not because he still believed it, but because he had begun to doubt. The initial, satisfying sting of righteous anger had faded, replaced by a dull, persistent ache of regret. He remembered Alara's face in the library, the shock in her eyes, the quiet dignity with which she had walked away. It was not the face of a hysterical, deceitful woman. It was the face of a woman whose world had just been shattered. The seed of doubt was small, but it found fertile ground in the emptiness of his life. It was watered by a chance comment from an old groom, a man who had served his father. "Strange thing, Your Grace," the old man had muttered one day while polishing tack. "That Dr. Albright came into a great deal of money right after Her Grace left. Bought himself a fine practice in Bath, he did, for a man who was nearly struck off for his gambling debts." The words landed like stones in the still pool of Alistair's apathy. Gambling debts. A sudden fortune. The timing. It was too neat. That night, for the first time in 5 years, Alistair acted not as Beatrice's puppet, but as the Duke of Blackwood. He wrote a letter to a discreet inquiry agent in London, a man known for his tenacity and his ability to unearth secrets buried deeper than treasure. The agent, a quiet man named Fletcher, worked with surgical precision. Within a month, the first report arrived. It contained financial records. A large anonymous deposit had been made into Dr. Albright's bank account the day after Alara's disappearance. A week later, Fletcher's second report arrived. It detailed Lady Beatrice's accounts. Over the years, she had been systematically siphoning funds from the estate, small amounts at first, then larger, more brazen thefts, all disguised as household expenses. She had been robbing him blind for 2 decades. The final piece of the puzzle came from Bath. Fletcher had found Dr. Albright, now riddled with consumption and a guilty conscience. For a modest sum, the dying man had written a full confession, detailing how Lady Beatrice had blackmailed him, using his debts to force him to participate in her cruel deception. She had coached him on what to say, feeding him the lie about Alistair's affliction, a fiction she herself had invented and cultivated over years of subtle suggestion. Alistair sat in his library, the same room where he had condemned his wife, and read the confession. The words on the page blurred. A cold, sickening rage, unlike anything he had ever known, washed over him. It was not a hot, explosive anger, but a glacial fury. He had been a fool, a blind, arrogant, weak-willed fool. He had not been betrayed by Alara. He had been manipulated, played and controlled by the one person he had trusted implicitly. And in his foolishness, he had destroyed the one person who had been utterly innocent. He had thrown away his wife, his duchess, his unborn child. The desolation that followed was absolute. It was a crushing weight of guilt that threatened to suffocate him. He had to find her. He had to know if she was safe. He had to beg for a forgiveness he knew, in his heart, he did not deserve. Fletcher's final report was a thin one. A woman matching Alara's description, a widow named Ellen Price, had been traced to a remote coastal village. Farley. Alistair traveled north in a plain, unmarked carriage, a single valet his only companion. The journey felt like a pilgrimage toward his own damnation. With every mile that passed, his dread grew. What would he find? A woman broken by hardship? Or worse, a woman who had found a new life, a new happiness, one that had no room for the man who had ruined her. He arrived in Farley on a bright, windswept morning. The air tasted of salt and fish. Gulls cried overhead. It was a world away from the manicured, suffocating stillness of Blackwood. He left his carriage at the inn and walked into the town square, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. And then he saw her. She was standing behind a humble wooden stall, arranging bunches of vibrant blue cornflowers in a clay pot. She wore a simple brown dress and a white apron, her dark hair pinned up loosely, stray curls escaping to frame her face. She was thinner, yes, and the fine lady's softness was gone, replaced by a wiry strength. But she was more beautiful than he had ever remembered. There was a life in her face, a quiet confidence he had never seen before. He started to walk toward her, his legs feeling unsteady. He didn't know what he would say. "I'm sorry," felt like a pathetic insult. "I was wrong" was a continent of understatement. Before he could reach her, a small boy with a mop of dark, unruly hair darted out from behind the stall, chasing a butterfly. The boy stumbled and fell, his laughter turning into a startled cry. Alara was there in an instant, kneeling on the cobblestones, scooping him into her arms. "Hush now, Thomas. It's just a little scrape. You're all right." The boy sniffled, burying his face in her shoulder. Then he seemed to sense Alistair's presence. He turned his head, his tears arrested, and looked up at the tall, somber man standing a few feet away. Alistair's world stopped turning. He was staring into his own eyes, the same unusual shade of slate gray, flecked with silver, the same shape, the same direct, unwavering gaze. It was like looking at a portrait of himself as a child, a portrait he had seen 100 times in the long gallery at Blackwood. It was undeniable. It was impossible. It was the truth. His son. The breath left his body in a ragged gasp. All the air in the world had been sucked into a vacuum. The boy, Thomas, tilted his head, his expression one of pure, childish curiosity. He tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mama," he said, his small voice carrying clearly across the square. "Who is the sad man?" Alara's head snapped up. Her eyes met Alistair's. For a moment she showed no recognition, only the wary defensiveness of a mother sensing a threat. Then, as her eyes truly focused, a wave of emotions washed over her face, one after the other, too fast to name. Shock, disbelief, fear, and finally, a cold, hard anger that was as formidable as the cliffs behind the town. She stood slowly, pulling Thomas behind her skirt, her body a shield. "You," she breathed, the word a puff of white in the chilly air. It was not a question. It was an accusation. "Ilara," he managed to say, his voice raw. "My name is Ellen," she snapped, her voice low and fierce. "The woman you knew is gone. You have no right to be here. Leave." He took a step forward, his hands half raised in a gesture of appeal. "Please, I know everything. The doctor, Beatrice. It was all a lie. I was a fool." Her laughter was a short, bitter sound, devoid of humor. "A fool? Is that what you call it? You were a judge and a jury and an executioner. You condemned me without a trial, without a single question. You believed her." The simple statement struck him with the force of a physical blow because it was the heart of the matter. It was the unforgivable sin. "You threw me away like I was nothing," she continued, her voice trembling with a fury that had been buried for 5 long years. "You and that viper you call an aunt. You would have locked me away to rot. So no, I do not want to hear your explanations. The Duke of Blackwood is dead to me. And as for my son," her grip tightened on Thomas's shoulder, "his father was a hero who died at sea. I will not have you poison that memory with your sadness." She began to pack her flowers with frantic, angry movements, her back to him. "He has my eyes," Alistair whispered, the words torn from him. She froze, her hands full of lavender. She did not turn around. "He has his father's eyes," she said, her voice like ice. "A brave sailor, not a coward who hides behind his title and believes the whispers of thieves." With that, she gathered her things, took Thomas firmly by the hand, and walked away without a backward glance, leaving Alistair standing alone in the middle of the market square. The townspeople stared at him, this well-dressed stranger who had brought their quiet flower seller to the brink of tears. He felt their judgment like a physical weight. He was the sad man, and he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that this was only the beginning of his penance. Alistair did not retreat. He did not flee back to the hollow comfort of his title and his lands. To leave now would be to confirm every terrible thing she believed him to be. It would be a second abandonment. He walked to the Salty Dog, the inn he had noted upon his arrival. Mrs. Gable, a woman with a formidable bosom and eyes that missed nothing, watched him approach her counter. "I need a room," he said, his voice quiet but firm. She sized him up, her gaze lingering on the fine cut of his coat, the quality of his boots, and the raw desolation in his face. "For how long, sir?" "I don't know," he answered honestly. "As long as it takes." The news that a duke was lodging at the local inn spread through Farley like wildfire. It was an absurdity, a disruption to the natural order of things. Alistair ignored the whispers, the pointed stares. He took his meals in the common room, enduring the awkward silence that fell whenever he entered. He was an alien creature, a creature of immense power and wealth who had chosen to strand himself in their simple world. He sent a message to his agent, Fletcher, summoning him and all the evidence he had gathered. He would not ask Alara to take his word for it. He would give her cold, hard proof. A week later, Fletcher arrived. Alistair, armed with the papers, approached Alara's cottage at dusk. He saw her through the window, sitting by the fire, mending one of Thomas's small shirts. The domestic tranquility of the scene was a knife in his gut. This was the life he had thrown away. He knocked. She opened the door a crack, her face set in hard lines. "I told you to leave," she said. "I will not ask you to listen to me," he said, keeping his voice low and steady. "But I ask that you look at this, and I will not do it alone. I want a witness." He glanced past her. "I would ask Mrs. Gable to be present." His request surprised her. It was not the demand of an arrogant duke, but the plea of a man seeking a fair hearing. She hesitated, then gave a curt nod. The meeting took place in the inn's private parlor. Mrs. Gable sat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking softly, a silent, formidable chaperone. Alistair laid the documents out on the small wooden table between him and Alara, the bank ledgers showing the payment to Albright, the meticulous records of Beatrice's embezzlement, and finally, the doctor's signed and witnessed confession. He did not embellish. He simply presented the facts, his voice a low monotone. He explained the years of manipulation, the slow poisoning of his mind against her, the carefully constructed lies. Alara read the confession, her face pale in the lamplight. Her expression was unreadable. When she finished, she folded the paper carefully and pushed it back across the table. "You have proven she is a thief and a liar," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "It does not change what you did. It does not change that you believed her." She stood up. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Gable." She nodded to the innkeeper and walked out of the room, her back ramrod straight. The proof had cleared Beatrice's name from the crime, but it had not touched Alistair's. His sin was one of faith, and it could not be erased by paper and ink. He remained in Farleigh. He became a strange, solitary fixture in the town. He took long, punishing walks along the cliff paths, the wind whipping at him, as if he could be scoured clean by the elements. He did not approach Alara again. He respected the boundaries she had drawn. Instead, he watched, from a distance. He saw the way she struggled to haul water from the town well and paid a local boy to do it for her, making the boy swear it was his own idea. He saw the leak in her cottage roof during a rainstorm and anonymously hired the town's only thatcher to repair it, paying him double to claim it was a long overdue town repair. He saw Thomas staring, day after day, at a beautifully carved wooden horse in the toymaker's window. The next morning, the horse appeared on Alara's doorstep, with no note, no card, nothing to indicate its origin. They were small, silent acts of service. They were not grand ducal gestures designed to impress, but the quiet, practical efforts of a man trying to mend a world he had broken. He also began to encounter Thomas. The boy was endlessly curious about the sad man who lived at the inn. He would find Alistair on his walks and pepper him with questions. "Why are your boots so shiny? Do you have a horse? Why don't you smile?" Alistair answered each question with grave seriousness. He never offered his name, never hinted at his identity. He was simply Alistair, a man staying in town. He learned about Thomas's world, his favorite tide pools, his fear of spiders, his deep love for his mother. Each conversation was a sweet form of torture, a glimpse into the life he should have had. After a month in Farleigh, he knew he had to finish it. He had to confront Beatrice. He left word with Mrs. Gable that he was traveling on business and would return. The confrontation at Blackwood was swift and brutal. He did not summon Beatrice to the library. He went to her sitting room, the heart of her power, and found her embroidering, a picture of serene, aristocratic grace. His solicitor was with him. He laid the confession on her embroidery hoop. She looked at it, then up at him, and for the first time, he saw fear in her eyes. The mask slipped. "Alistair," she began, her voice losing its silken edge. "Do not speak," he commanded, his voice echoing with an authority she had never heard from him before. "You will pack a bag. You will be taken to the Dowager House in Northumberland. You will remain there. Your allowance will be sufficient for your needs, but you will have no staff beyond a cook and a maid. You will have no visitors. You will not write to anyone. You will be erased from this family's history as surely as you tried to erase my wife." She paled, her composure shattering completely. "You cannot do this. I raised you. I protected this family." "You poisoned it," he said, his voice like chips of ice. "You did this for money and for power, and you destroyed lives to get it. You are lucky I do not turn you over to the authorities. Now get out of my sight." She stared at him, her mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. She saw in his cold, gray eyes that the boy she had molded and controlled was gone forever. In his place stood the Duke. He watched her leave, feeling not triumph, but a profound, weary emptiness. He had cut out the cancer. Now he had to see if the patient could survive. He returned to Farley that very night. A storm rolled in from the sea the evening he returned. It was a violent, furious thing, rattling the windows of the inn and sending waves crashing against the cliffs with a sound like cannon fire. Alistair sat in the common room, nursing a brandy, when Mrs. Gable hurried over to him. "It's Ellen's boy," she said, her face etched with worry. "He's terrified of the thunder. She can't seem to calm him." Without a second thought, Alistair was on his feet. He grabbed his coat and plunged out into the maelstrom. The wind and rain tore at him, but he barely felt it. He ran to the small cottage, the lantern by the door swinging wildly in the gale. He hammered on the door. It swung open, and Alara stood there, her hair wild, her face pale with exhaustion. Behind her, he could hear Thomas's terrified sobs. She looked at him, surprised, but there was no anger in her eyes now, only desperation. She stepped aside and let him in. The cottage was small and warm, a stark contrast to the fury outside. Thomas was huddled in a small chair by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, his small body shaking. Alistair walked over and knelt before the boy. He did not touch him. He simply met his frightened, tear-filled gaze. "It is a loud noise, isn't it?" Alistair said, his voice calm and low. Thomas nodded, a fresh sob shaking him. "My father once told me," Alistair continued, "that thunder is just the sound of giants bowling in the clouds. They are clumsy, and they keep dropping the heavy balls. It makes a tremendous racket, but it is nothing to be afraid of. It is just a silly game." Thomas's sobs began to subside. He looked at Alistair, his gray eyes wide with a dawning curiosity. "Giants?" "Enormous ones," Alistair affirmed gravely, "with big, bushy beards and terrible aim." A small, watery giggle escaped the boy. Alistair stayed for over an hour. He sat on the floor by Thomas's chair, telling him stories of dragons and clumsy giants and brave sailors who navigated by the stars. Alara watched from the other side of the hearth, silent. She watched this stranger, this Duke, this sad man, patiently and gently coax her son out of his terror. She saw not a title or a fortune, but a father. She saw the man she had once, long ago, hoped he might be. The armor that had protected her heart for 5 long years began to feel heavy, and for the first time she felt the sharp, painful crack of a fissure running through it. When the storm had passed and Thomas was fast asleep, his head in Alistair's lap, Alara finally spoke. "You should not have had to do that," she said quietly. "Yes," Alistair replied, his gaze fixed on the sleeping child. "I should have. 5 years ago." The silence that followed was different. It was not angry or tense, but filled with a profound, shared sorrow for all the years that had been lost. "I went back to Blackwood," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Beatrice is gone. She will never trouble you, or anyone, ever again." Alara nodded, absorbing this. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Alara," he said, finally looking up at her. His eyes were raw with a pain that mirrored her own. "There are no words, no actions that can erase what I did. I failed you. I failed you as a man, as a husband, long before Beatrice ever told her lie. I was cold and distant and proud. I was a fool who owned everything and valued nothing, least of all, the best thing I ever had." His confession was stark, stripped of all artifice. It was the truth. Tears she had not shed in 5 years welled in Alara's eyes. They were not tears of anger, but of a deep, aching grief. For the girl she had been, for the man he had failed to be, for the son who had been raised on a lie. She walked over and carefully lifted the sleeping Thomas from his lap. As she held her son, she looked at Alistair, who remained kneeling on the floor, his head bowed, a duke brought low not by circumstance, but by the weight of his own failure. She saw the truth of his penance. It was not in the repaired roof or the wooden horse. It was here, in this humble cottage, in his quiet patience, in his gentleness with their son, in the profound, humbling change she had witnessed with her own eyes. Forgiveness was not a feeling. It was a choice, a terrifying, difficult choice. It meant opening a door that had been bolted shut for years. It meant risking her heart, and her son's, all over again. "Thomas deserves to know his father," she said, her voice soft but steady. "The real one, not the ghost in a story." She paused, taking a breath that felt like her first in 5 years. "And perhaps, so do I." Alistair looked up, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw a flicker of unguarded, desperate hope in his slate-gray eyes. He did not rush to her. He did not make promises. He simply nodded, accepting her words as the fragile, precious gift they were. It was not an end. It was a beginning. Their return to Blackwood was not a grand affair. They arrived in the same plain carriage Alistair had taken to Farley. Alara, she was Alara again now, stepped out not as a returning duchess, but as a woman coming home on her own terms. She held Thomas's hand, and Alistair stood beside her, not in front of her. They were a family, partners. The house was still cold, still vast, but the oppressive silence was gone. It was shattered by the sound of a little boy's running feet and his delighted shrieks as he discovered the endless corridors were perfect for games of hide-and-seek. Life was not instantly perfect. There was a hesitancy between them, a careful navigation around the deep wounds of the past. But it was real. They talked for hours, late into the night, sharing the stories of their 5 lost years. He told her of his empty, hollow existence, and she told him of the hardships and the simple joys of her life in Farley, of the strength she had found in herself. Alara did not resume the life of an ornamental duchess. She took an active role in the management of the estate. Her practical, hard-won knowledge from her years of self-sufficiency proved invaluable. She saw the tenants not as names in a ledger, but as people, families like the ones she had known in Farley. Together, she and Alistair began to implement changes, improving cottages, lowering rents, and building a school. They were using their power not to hoard it, but to do good. One bright summer afternoon, a year after their return, Alistair found Alara in the West Garden. The formal, sculpted rose bushes and sterile gravel paths were gone. In their place was a riot of color and life. She had replanted it herself, filling it with the same humble, vibrant flowers she had once sold from a market stall. Cornflowers, lavender, daisies, and sweet peas. It was a piece of Farley, a piece of her true self, blooming in the heart of Blackwood. He watched her for a moment, her hands in the soil, a smudge of dirt on her cheek, a contented smile on her face. She was home. Nearby, Thomas was trying to teach a very patient hound to sit. The boy looked up and saw his father watching. He grinned, that wide, gap-toothed smile that could melt glaciers. "Father," he called out, his voice full of uncomplicated joy. "Come and see. I think he almost understands." Alistair smiled, a genuine, easy smile that reached his eyes. He crossed the lawn and sat on the grass, pulling his son into his lap. Alara came and sat beside them, leaning her head on his shoulder. The three of them sat there, in the middle of the garden she had remade, the warm sun on their faces, the air filled with the scent of lavender, and the sound of a child's laughter. The sad man was gone. The ghosts had been banished. The gilded cage had become a home, its foundation not stone and title, but hard-won forgiveness and a love that had been broken, lost, and finally, miraculously, rebuilt